Bienvenidos a este ciclo de conferencias que hemos organizado la tercera y la otra mirada y que esta vez está dedicado a la pregunta quizás más fundamental que nos estamos haciendo como sociedad. ¿Es posible combinar la salud con el regreso de la economía? ¿Es posible combinar que no hayan o haya menos muertes infectados con la posibilidad de generar empleo? Sabemos que tenemos dos crisis. Tenemos la crisis de la salud y la crisis del empleo. Y esta pregunta la queremos abordar de manera responsable porque es una urgencia para el planeta comenzar y volver a trabajar. El mes pasado se perdieron 20 millones de empleos en Estados Unidos y en Chile ya se está hablando de una cifra de 2 dígitos cercana al 14%. Es por eso que este es un tema importante de abordar. Y para eso queremos hablar con un ejecutivo, con un empresario, porque finalmente la recuperación de los empleos pasa por la empresa, pasa por el ingenio de aquellos hombres que han creado grandes empresas, que hoy día están en problemas y que tienen que volver a recuperarse. Algunas de ellas no las tendremos más. No sabemos cómo quedará el mapa empresarial en lo que viene. Cuántas aerolíneas habrán, cuántos hoteles, cuántas empresas van a desaparecer. Algunas de ellas ya han quebrado. Pero sí sabemos que es el ingenio de los empresarios, de los hombres de negocios, de aquellos que se dedican a crear nuevas empresas, de ellos depende el futuro y lo que viene. Para hoy tenemos a Polman, quien fuera director ejecutivo de Unilever durante 10 años. Un hombre que se caracterizó por dos cosas. La primera, por hacer de Unilever una empresa muy exitosa, es decir, una empresa con utilidades. Pero la segunda, ser una empresa que entendió la responsabilidad social y empresarial que tienen las organizaciones en el mundo moderno, y es por eso que para él el flujo de caja, las utilidades eran tan importantes como el cuidado al medio ambiente, el ser una empresa socialmente responsable. Estos son valores que van a ser muy importantes en el mundo que viene. Y por lo tanto, para la tercera y la otra mirada, es un privilegio poder conversar hoy con Polman. Muchas gracias.
Enfrentamos momentos críticos. La pandemia no solamente implica una crisis de salud y con todos los efectos sociales que ello conlleva, sino que también va a tener un impacto económico gravísimo. En el mes del mar, nunca está de más reflexionar acerca de nuestra historia y esos momentos en que el país tuvo que unirse para poder enfrentar desafíos que comprometían la propia existencia de la República. La invitación hoy día es a reflexionar acerca del rol de las empresas y de los empresarios. En la tercera edición de La Otra Mirada, nosotros invitamos al profesor Luigi Zingales, quien nos habló acerca de qué es lo que había que hacer para salvar al capitalismo de los capitalistas. Una crítica constructiva acerca del rol que tienen las empresas y el mercado. Ahora invitamos a Polman a profundizar este tema. Desde luego, las empresas tienen una misión muy relevante en su accionar diario. Eso de ofrecerle a sus clientes o usuarios algo que sea distinto y mejor, y de asignar acertadamente, cuidadosamente, los recursos que los accionistas le han asignado, muchos de los cuales hoy día son fondos de pensiones. Pero más allá de eso, ¿la empresa tiene un rol social? Bueno, por cierto que sí. Polman nos va a ayudar a entender mejor ese rol social. La empresa no vive en un vacío, es parte de la sociedad y tiene como propósito ulterior crear valor compartido. La invitación en esta 13ª edición de La Otra Mirada es reflexionar acerca de este rol social e inspirarnos para poder, como empresarios, tomar el guante y ayudar decididamente a recuperar la economía de este país, que va a sufrir los estragos de esta pandemia. Bienvenidos a La Otra Mirada.
Hi, Paul, and thank you for joining this conversation with La Otra Mirada, La Tercera, and our audience.
Thank you, Claudio. True honor to be here.
Thank you. The coronavirus pandemic is a human tragedy. Millions of people are affected by the crisis in all countries across the world. And it is also having a significant impact on the global economy. I am sure we will defeat the virus together, but we'll also face in the future other crises and threats. So, in our opinion, there is an urgent need to fundamentally rethink the role and contribution of the business community. About this topic, we would like to talk to you today. And let me start, Paul, with this question. You are perhaps best known for your leadership of Unilever, where you accelerated its drive to embed sustainability in the business. And this is the question, Paul. When and why did you start working on sustainability? And when did you realize that it was such a high priority?
Well, thank you, Claudio. I started working on it from day one. I became CEO of Unilever at the end of 2008, which was really in the midst of the financial crisis, where I could see that an economic system that depended too much on high levels of debt at private or government level, overconsumption, leaving too many people behind, was not a sustainable model. And I think the crisis showed that if too many people feel that they're not included or participating, they will ultimately rebel. When I joined Unilever, my mission was to grow the company and grow it successfully. And you can only grow a company successfully if you respond to the needs of society out there. So sustainability, or putting a business model out there that is more sustainable and equitable, is a business model that responds to the needs of the consumers of this world. It allowed us to become an outside-in company, if you want to, versus an inside-out company. I always felt that the myopic focus of many companies on the shareholder alone and maximizing shareholder wealth was not a long-term strategy. A little bit more difficult 10 years ago to show that, but I think we have now overwhelming evidence that that is not a good way to run your business. So a multi-stakeholder, longer-term model that has at its core a strong purpose to serve society is a model that I believe is long-term more successful and a tremendous business opportunity. And we've seen it in Unilever over the 10 years with a 300% shareholder return and a growth rate more or less at double the level of our competitors.
And based on that, Unilever has over 400 brands. It's a significant company. How did you use the scale and size of Unilever to connect with consumers? And specifically, how do you define responsible business?
So those are two questions. One of the things is when you are a big company like Unilever, 50 billion plus in turnover, 190 countries that we operate in, some people say, that might be bureaucratic or slow, that's a disadvantage. I've always thought about scale becoming an advantage and compensating for the things that would pull you in a different direction. We were reaching about 3 billion consumers every day in the 190 countries. And I always looked at that as an enormous opportunity to drive transformative change in the world. The main thing we do, obviously, is first of all, at the corporate level, ensure that we have a responsible policy as a total company, because ultimately it is the reputation of your total company that decides your long-term success. So we put a strategy in place that we called the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, which had a simple objective to double the turnover, but to halve our environmental footprint. In other words, decoupling our growth from environmental footprint and increasing our overall social footprint. We put some audacious goals behind that, like sustainable sourcing, like providing 5 million jobs for women in our value chain, like cutting the greenhouse gas emissions and becoming carbon positive, as we called it. And we put 50 targets behind that because we believe that having these commitments and being open about it would establish the trust that we needed to create these enormous partnerships to attack these challenges. And then at the second level, next to our corporate commitments, we obviously work with our brands. As you rightfully say, Claudio, we have 400 brands. And these brands are our direct connections with consumers. And for us, it was very important that each of these brands fulfilled a strong purpose. And it made these brands very motivating to work for, but it also made them much more effective in trying to find solutions. A brand like Domestos was all of a sudden focused on building toilets when 1.5 billion people still have open defecation. Our Baso brands were providing sanitation to help children reach the age of 5. You're familiar with our Dove brand, working women's self-esteem. And anytime we linked one of these brands with the Sustainable Development Goals and created this higher purpose, we saw it accelerating in turnover and growing faster, but we also saw it being more profitable. And that created a momentum that helped us build a successful company over the 10 years. You can't do everything, but with a little bit of, with good, smart people and making choices, you can really excel by bringing purpose to the heart of all your businesses.
Great, fantastic. And let's move now, Paul, to talk something about COVID-19. The coronavirus has changed the world overnight. How would you score the response from the business community? And in the same sense, do you think the pandemic will leave a lasting impression on our economies, societies, organizations, and business culture?
Well, I think the results of the reactions of business have been mixed. There are businesses that have used this situation for their own benefit and again looked just myopically after their shareholders. Fortunately, that's the minority, and these businesses are being called out and actually are under pressure. The majority of businesses have said, we have a job to do here. We have to save lives. We have to protect livelihoods. And then we have to be sure that we learn the lessons from this crisis and come out much better. And overwhelmingly, I would say, business has been incredibly responsible. We have seen new forms of partnership emerging to produce masks, to produce ventilators, to go together in the distribution and manage distribution systems, in some cases even sharing factories and planning the supply. So overall, I think business has scored well. And in many cases, in many countries, they've actually been earlier to protect their employees and to take action in their value chain than many of the governments. But the most important thing is not only what the businesses do now, but also that we come out obviously much stronger than when we went in. You asked for the definition of responsible business, and that is business that profitably attacks and responds to the issues of people and planet. And I think what the COVID crisis has taught us is that there is no healthy people on an unhealthy planet. It has shown us the relationships between nature and biodiversity, health and climate. 75% of the viruses and pandemics originate in animals, and by our destruction of nature and getting more closely in contact with the biodiversity and the animal world, we're actually also importing a lot of new viruses. And so people are aware of it. And we've seen business rally to the challenge. We've seen alliances being formed around energy companies wanting to move faster to green energy, major commitments from companies like Shell or Duke Energy or leading companies like Enel in Italy and many others. And we've seen companies come together, especially around the food and land use, and say, hey, this is a big crisis. There are many people suffering. Food security is even becoming a bigger issue. We need to work this together. So I think it has created a momentum that brought the environmental part higher on the agenda, but also increasingly the social part. And interestingly, the financial market is now interested as well. The financial market has seen that the risk of not treating your people very well or not having good relationships with your suppliers in your value chain can seriously put your business at risk. So I think it has tipped the balance towards more responsible business models coming out of it. There are pressures that some people are trying to find short-term solutions that probably go in the wrong direction. We see some of that across the world. But overall, I think it has created a momentum that builds on what had already started before the crisis to go to a more responsible, inclusive, and sustainable business model.
And based on that, we are facing the worst economic crisis in years or decades. How do you see the near future? Are you optimistic, Paul?
Well, you have to be optimistic, but I would say a certain level of hope. It is clear that we actually were already moving to a more sustainable world. The climate movement, I think, was building up, but also we were increasingly having debates on how to make a more inclusive economy with this growing income disparity that we had seen, and many people voicing their discontent either at the ballot boxes or in the streets in many countries in the world. The reality was, before the COVID crisis, we simply weren't moving fast enough, and we weren't moving at the scale that is needed. I think we have a unique opportunity now coming out of the COVID crisis to address that. We have spent $10 trillion right now in the global economy just to basically stabilize it. In the US, in China, and in Europe being the bigger spenders. What we now need to do is to ensure that the money that we spent to restart these economies again is spent responsibly. And what does it mean responsibly? There is no doubt that we have created a higher level of unemployment. In the US, 33 million people, 14.5% of the official workforce is unemployed. But you also know in many countries like Chile, like the US, there is an unofficial workforce that is not even in the statistics, that is often more affected by it. So companies have discovered that we can work differently now as a result of the crisis. And I haven't met any CEO yet over the last few weeks that tells me that he can be more efficient as they come out of the crisis. So the biggest issue is going to be employment. The biggest issue is going to ensure, especially amongst the young people, that we create not only jobs, but provide also a social safety network. If we do this, then I think we will be in a reasonably good shape. If we don't do this, we risk that we get more polarization, populist governments, nationalism, and we risk actually moving into the wrong direction. And that's the big lesson of 2006, 2007, when we didn't spend enough attention around that. Now we have an opportunity. It happens to be that technology has developed. We have more data. We know that green jobs are actually economically more viable. We've seen the cost of wind and solar come down. In 3/4 of the world, it's already cheaper than fossil fuel. And we also have discovered that the green jobs are actually better jobs. They're actually better paying jobs. It creates more jobs. And it is a healthier world. 90% of the people in Europe have said, we don't want to go back to where we came from. And we've also discovered with COVID that the poorest people are the ones that lived in the areas that were most polluted or didn't have access to the right healthcare system or nutrition, were the ones that paid, again, once more the price for it. So now we have an opportunity to redesign it. Retrofit buildings, making bike paths, making pedestrian paths, reforesting our land, trying to accelerate the move to the green energy transformation, stop the perverse subsidies on fossil fuel. If you can put a price on carbon, like more and more countries are doing. And if we do this smartly enough, we can create the jobs and we can create this more equitable and sustainable economy. And then I think we're in a better shape. So I have hope, but it's in our hands. It's not the COVID crisis that is going to decide how we're going to behave afterwards. It's a collective of us. And I hope that we've taken these lessons on board and start to behave like responsible citizens.
Let me insist in this point. You have repeatedly said that the Sustainable Development Goals and also the Paris Agreement are the world's greatest business plan.
Correct.
Do you think we are on track to deliver the goals by 2030? And will governments and businesses invest enough this decade, considering the COVID, to manage the situation and to take this economic toll that we are facing due to the pandemic? How do you see we are progressing as a world?
Well, the reality indeed is when in September 2015, 193 countries came to the UN, including Chile, obviously, and signed the Sustainable Development Goals. And then a few months later in Paris, the Paris Agreement, we were all very optimistic. And we had good reasons to be optimistic because the previous 15 years, we actually had the Millennial Development Goals, which had as objective to halve the number of people in poverty. And we actually achieved that 3 years earlier. Unfortunately, the Sustainable Development Goals came in the middle of the recuperating from the financial crisis. And at the financial crisis, we put in a lot of money, but not against the real economy. We rescued the banking system, but we did not take care of the acceleration of the conversion of the economy that was needed. And as a result, we were on a trajectory that was pretty far behind on the Sustainable Development Goals. In fact, on the trajectory before COVID, it would be till 2071 that we would achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. As I mentioned before, climate change alone is still today on a 3%, 3 degree plus trajectory. So to answer your question, Claudio, we were terribly off track. But I think that the COVID crisis has increased the level of awareness, an awareness to science and the need to respect science, which many countries were violating behind climate change, a need to have global cooperation, which we frankly have not shown between the governments on many of the issues that were needed to be tackled with COVID, and also a stronger link between the nature and nature-based solutions and the importance of nature to our economy. These are important things. And COVID has also shown that collective action from the citizens of this world, from the businesses now, behind what we talked, the actions to save lives and livelihoods, I think we are getting into an era of new forms of partnership that I'm very optimistic about. However, it does require ultimately the governments to be responsible, to put the right laws and frameworks in place. And governments have lately been very short-term and very nationalistically oriented. So can we build up enough positive pressure to also get the governments on board and move responsibly forward will be a big part of the equation. We have a big issue in global governance. We are still living with institutions that were developed in 1944. We have governments that have decided on unilateralism, not supporting the World Health Organization in the middle of the crisis is one example of that, with the US pooling its money. So I hope that we can get together again and realize that we are first and foremost citizens of planet Earth. The business community understands it. They see the enormous opportunities. The citizens of this world demand it. Increasingly, the financial market is catching on. Our employees are asking us for it, as we all know. So I think that also if we put all of our efforts together, we can move the governments hopefully as well to the right direction. And I have to say the Chilean government has set an example. You are the second country after Suriname that has submitted already higher targets. You want to be peaking your carbon at 2030. Hopefully you can do it a little bit earlier. And you've also, rightfully so, put a strong social package in there to ensure that the actions you take especially benefit the too many people in society still that feel that they're left behind. So I have to be optimistic of all the good things I see, but we also have to be very mindful that we have a lot of work to do still. These are major changes in the economy that need to happen. Changing our food system, our energy system, changing our health systems, changing still our financial system, our social system and making it more inclusive, and then trying to do that at a time that we need to have governments work better is a task that we need to be ready for, and it requires the best of all of us. There simply isn't an alternative. Anybody who tells you, let's go back to where we came from, or we don't need to do all these things, are fooling yourselves and themselves. And we simply cannot afford that. We made that mistake in Europe after World War I. We got World War II. Some countries made that mistake again in the 2007-2008 recession, where we're still recuperating from. Let's not sit here 10 years from now and say, hey, we should have done this and this. We've never been so forewarned to do something about this crisis, to come out better. And frankly, we've never been so forearmed with solutions to do something about it. And it's, again, once more, one of the biggest business opportunities that I've seen in the history of mankind, which makes it so exciting.
And based on that, you have been a passionate advocate for a more equal world in light of huge social inequalities in many communities. Thus, this became even more urgent in a post-COVID world. What can we do?
Absolutely. It's the most important thing, I would say. Although we focus on climate change and sustainability, and I've talked about that in this pleasant talk with you, the reality is it all has to go back to why are we doing this? And the overall reason why we have the Sustainable Development Goals is to leave no one behind. We still live in a world, despite lifting people out of poverty, where we have about 1.5 billion people living below what we would call the minimal acceptable poverty line of $1.90 a day. But if you make that $5 or $10 a day, which are the real numbers, we probably have more than half of our population falling below these levels. Many in middle classes have not seen their incomes go up for the last 30 or 40 years. In the US now, over 20% of people depend again on food programs and support. 1 in 3 doesn't have extended health care. So the COVID crisis, as well as the climate crisis, have given us an enormous exposure on the risks of leaving too many people behind. So as we go through this transition, we need to be sure that we make it socially inclusive. And again, it would be better for business to be sure that we lift more people out of poverty. We'll also expand the markets. To be sure that we take care of the people in our value chain, we'll create more loyal employees. To provide a social safety net around people, we'll get rid of a lot of the issues that we deal with now in mental stress or in violence, in other areas of insecurity that we see in society. So a just transition is very important. And business broadly understands that. So what does that mean? That means that in everything we do, let's take the food and agriculture, where we need to transform ourselves to a more sustainable food system, cut waste, attack issues like malnutrition or obesity on the other end. We need to be sure that we take care of the right rural transition, where all the poor farmers are located, and put a special emphasis on that. When we talk about greening energy, we again need to be sure that the poor immediately jump to things like microgrids or green energy, and that they are inclusive. And when we change industries, for example, getting out of coal or moving out of fossil fuel in total to the green energy, which now needs to happen at an accelerated rate, we need to be sure that we spend enough time on training and developing the people. There are wonderful companies out there now, like the Salesforces or the IKEAs or the Bayers, etc., that have put a lot of emphasis on retraining their employees or making a social contract work better for them. And that's an integral part. We see countries like Spain or China or now France making it such an important part of their economic transition packages to be sure that money is put aside to help retrain, reschool, and put a minimum level of social support behind our everybody in society, especially the ones that need it most. So a just transition is probably one of the most important things we can do behind this transition.
Great, thank you. If I may, Paul, I would like to talk something about leadership. We are facing tremendous challenges, and we'll have to deal with crises and even threats in this volatile and uncertain world. What are the 21st century skills and values every leader and company need?
Well, first of all, I want to say, Claudio, that we've seen incredible leadership of many people during this crisis. And first and foremost, I want to go to the healthcare workers that risk their own lives to be out there to help us. The truckers, the people that provide the groceries or the food so we can eat. Many of them working still in gig economies to keep technologies like this going. So, but we've also discovered that many of these people that help us were not very appreciated before and were probably not very well compensated before. So that is part of this just transition. But they are the real leaders, and we should thank them and use this opportunity to express our gratefulness to them especially. But having said that, there are also many leaders that we have seen in businesses and other parts of society that have stepped up during the COVID crisis. And what makes them special is that they have shown a high level of humanity. This is above all a human crisis. And the new leadership form is one of humility and humanity. And that's difficult for some of the CEOs, but it's absolutely key if we want to go out of this. The employees have now discovered which companies care for them and which companies don't care for them. And I can tell you it makes a huge difference. Then we need to have the different forms of partnership. The issues that we have talked about are of such magnitude that none of us can solve it alone. And we need to become all very skilled to work with civil society, with others in our industries, but also with government. There's no question that government is going to take a bigger role in the economy with the money that they've put in and some of the conditions that hopefully are attached to that money that is put in. So we need leaders that can work in these partnerships. We need leaders that are more purpose-driven. And we need leaders that think intergenerational. And these are very important qualities. Interestingly, you find many of these qualities in female leaders more naturally than in male leaders. And it is no surprise to me that the countries that have done well during this COVID crisis, and Chile I have to compliment as well, but take the Nordic countries like Iceland, like Norway, like Denmark, like Finland, like Taiwan, and some others, they happen to all have female leaders. New Zealand, tremendous job. So these skills of humility, humanity, partnership, purpose-driven, intergenerational are the ones that we have to celebrate moving forward.
And can you tell us a bit more about Imagine and its work to support the so-called courageous CEOs? And in that sense, are you beginning to see any traction in industries working together to redesign their value chains so they are more sustainable?
Yeah, absolutely, Claudio. It was already an honor to be 10 years CEO of Unilever, but I've only been able to do that for 10 years and not lose my attention span because I used the last 5 years to leverage the company's scale and size to drive more transformative impact in this world, getting out of deforestation, addressing issues of human rights, getting into the supply chains and driving behavior there at scale. And that was very motivating to do. But if you work as a CEO in your own company, you discover that even if with the best will of this world, you can only do so much. And it needs more to work in partnership, to work with governments. And sometimes you might not know how to do it, don't have the times or the skill sets. So we created Imagine as a foundation and for benefit corporation after my retirement to look at systems change that we desperately need. And our theory of change is very simple, that if we get a big enough group of CEOs together across the value chain by industry, we can actually create tipping points. We do it by industry because there's inherent competitiveness and fear of losing out. So we want to, and it is focused. CEOs like to be focused. And then once we have a critical mass of CEOs together, we can work with civil society and governments to help change the political process or the frameworks that we need around it. We've been focusing in a relatively short period of time on a few industries that have the biggest impact on the Sustainable Development Goals. Our main focus, as you might not be surprised to hear, is inequality and climate change as a main driver. We started with the fashion industry. The fashion industry is a very big industry, but also the second biggest polluter, from biodiversity to plastic in the oceans to climate change to human rights standards. We pulled together at a relatively short time 66 companies in the fashion industry, which represent about 30 to 35% of the industry. And collectively, we've made a commitment to go to net zero by 2050, which is to stay below 1.5 degrees warming, to get out of single-use plastics, and to attack the issues of biodiversity with moving to regenerative cotton. None of the industry players can do that alone, but collectively we can do it. And interestingly, as we form these groups, more want to join. They don't want to miss the boat. They see the enormous opportunities, and governments want to work also to put these strategic structural changes in place. We've now put together actually 28 incredible CEOs in the food and land use, and they have decided to say, yes, we need long-term solutions, but we have an issue right now. And the issue is especially Africa with food security. We cannot go through another major crisis after this pandemic. And they've decided to come together and say, we're going to change the food supply structure short-term in Africa, but then long-term move to a more sustainable food system, a more equitable food system on a global level. So you see this enormous potential of bringing CEOs together. It makes them more courageous. It makes them able to do more things together than they can do alone and start these systems changes that we need in society. It's hard work, but I can tell you, Claudio, it's fun, especially after having been CEO so long. This is really something where I felt that I could make an even bigger impact with obviously the co-founders and the coalition that we have formed around it.
Great conversation, Paul. What is your final message to the Chilean audience?
Well, vamos a hacer en español, porque yo tengo mucha ganas de este continente y sobre todo el país de Chile. Chile ha hecho un trabajo formidable con el COP25. No ha sido fácil, es un mundo que no es fácil, pero toda la gente de Chile han trabajado juntos con el mundo entero. El mensaje va a ser juntos. No podemos resolver todos los retos que nosotros han hablado en esta charla formidable si no trabajamos juntos. Somos sobre todo en el primer plan las ciudades de este mundo entero y somos conectados más que las diferencias que los políticos o las empresas o la prensa quieren mostrar. Somos juntos en esta batalla de construir un mundo mejor por todo el mundo y de asegurar que no vamos a olvidar a ninguna persona. Y podemos hacerlo. Con nuestra fuerza juntos podemos cambiar el mundo y comenzamos con ahora o mañana, o yo quiero decir antes de ayer. Pero mucha suerte con este viaje. No va a ser fácil, pero va a ser la única respuesta en esta crisis. Y las generaciones en el futuro van a decir simplemente gracias por este esfuerzo y gracias para todo el mundo.
Muchas gracias a ti, Paul. Ha sido una fantástica conversación contigo. Nos has inspirado. Has justamente marcado el camino, como bien dices, de la colaboración, del trabajo unidos, estar juntos en este desafío.
No, gracias a ti, Claudio, también por el trabajo que tú haces y para asegurar que el Chile va a salir mejor que han entrado. So, mucha suerte en este viaje.
Thank you very much, and we hope to see you in the near future in Chile. Thanks again, and take care. Bye.
Hasta pronto, un abrazo virtual.
Muchas gracias, que esté muy bien. Hasta luego.
La invitación es a tomar en cuenta los conceptos que Polman ha compartido con nosotros hoy día para poder orientar la acción que nos corresponde a nosotros como empresarios, especialmente en estos momentos tan delicados que enfrentamos como país. Y quisiera agradecer muy especialmente al entrevistador, a don Claudio Muñoz de Icare, un hombre muy comprometido con esta idea y esta responsabilidad de generar valor compartido. Y a nuestro media partner, por cierto, a La Tercera.